So here we are. We're having this conversation, Provoke and Inspire, the podcast. And I'm so excited to be talking to you, Elijah. It's been a long time coming. I've been a fan of what you do, your online content and your heart. And so, dude, thank you. Thanks for being on the Provoke and Inspire podcast.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Yeah, dude. So look, your bio very briefly shares a little bit about your story, how you came to Jesus. And I have the privilege of speaking a lot in churches and talking to a lot of church leaders. And I think one of the universal cries of the collective church's heart is that young people, and often their own kids, would come not only to know Jesus, but to follow him in a radical way. Mm. And you seem to be, I think, the embodiment of what so many pastors and church leaders and just church people in general would want to see for their own kids. And so what happened, man? How did you buck the trend and be someone that came to love Jesus and want to serve him with all your heart? Yeah,
it's not an infrequent experience where I finish preaching somewhere and then a parent comes up and they're like, how do I get my kid to be like you? And I'm always like, I didn't make me like this. I don't know. I think that I legitimately, honestly met Jesus as a kid, probably during church camp. I don't come from, I'm not a PK. A lot of people ask if I'm a pastor's kid, which I do take as an insult. I'm not.
So what is it about the label that you would find insulting?
Have you ever met a PK? They're just the worst people. No,
I'm an MK, but dude, I strongly disassociate with the label as well. Close so enough. I feel you. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I come from I'm kidding, but I do come from quite the opposite background. I don't, just a really messy family situation. My family was really, really broken in a lot of ways as a kid. But we were still in the church. And so I just learned to absolutely I loved the church. The church was my safe place. And so when I got to go to church camp that summer, I'd already built a knowledge of the Bible. I just loved the Bible. I loved the stories. I loved, the teachings of Jesus. I just thought it was also interesting, even as a kid. It was Bible, World War II. And that was my areas of interest as a kid.
Dude, me as World War, yes. I'm with you.
Those two things I was super into. So then I got baptized at I think I was in 5th grade, and I knew exactly what I was doing. Then as I grew up and I kind of became a bit more cognizant of all the messiness in my home, it started to have, I would say, a more obvious effect on me, the way that I viewed myself and the way that I viewed my family and my future. And I turned emo, legitimately. I had the full, the swoop, and I would cry because I couldn't wear girl jeans. The jeans that they sold were not skinny enough. I didn't look like the dudes who were the lead singers of the bands I liked. I'd wear all the bracelets, and I was making band fan accounts on Instagram. I did the full thing, and just took on the persona of a loner, loser. That's just how I felt about myself. Which is a bummer. I had all the workings to be cool, and I just, I gave it up right in that moment. I surrendered that, and it never really happened. Never got it back. But then I had an experience with the Holy Spirit when I was going into my freshman year, where I felt the presence of God in a way that I never had before, and I very rarely have since, to that extent, to that measure, where it was there is somebody here. And it was during a worship service that wasn't even in English. I just was I need to give my life to God. I have nowhere else to go. And my legs just buckled. I couldn't stand anymore. And I dropped and just wept for 2 hours, and then left that place just a different human being. So now I've just been trying to follow Jesus as well as I can since then. And my parents gave their lives to the Lord not shortly after, and my siblings are all on journeys with the Lord now. It's really great.
Awesome. Wow. Okay. So what happened after that? I know you kind of went down this social media rabbit hole a little bit, and that kind of morphed over time and turned into this kind of role that you have of a speaker, teacher, influencer. What happened? How did that happen? How did you go from comedy to what you do now?
Yeah. Okay.
And do you still have a yearning in your heart to return to the glory days of your your comedic endeavors
No,
on TikTok.
not at all. I have like close friends who do like comedy sketches on the internet, and I'm just glad that's not my life. I'm just not smart enough for it. Like they're just smarter than me, and they have better ideas, and I would never be able to compete. Yeah. So long story short, I had that moment with the Holy Spirit, and I'm a charismatic, so many people have a profound moment with the Holy Spirit, and they start speaking in tongues. Well, that didn't happen to me. Okay. And I believe in the Holy Spirit, believe in the baptism of the Holy Spirit. But that wasn't my experience. I woke up and I started teaching, and not spontaneously. Like, the words weren't just like coming out of my mouth, but the few chapters of the Bible that I'd read made sense in a new way, and I had a profound desire to explain them to people. And that didn't go away. That became the way that I felt oriented towards the church and the Bible. Was like, oh, I feel like I get what's going on here. I want to explain how meaningful this is. Or even how simple this can be to people who don't get it or don't see it. Like, I just want to do that. And so I started Bible study when I was 15, preached my first sermon at 16. I just absolutely fell in love with preaching and teaching the Word of God. The first sermon I did, I came off stage and I was like, that was the best moment of my life. That was the coolest feeling ever. And so then probably 6 months after that sermon, my first like Christian video blew up after that phase of comedy that you're talking about. I got on and I started doing apologetics. I was just like, here's why I believe in God. Here's why the Bible's reliable. Here's why I'm a Christian. And here's why I'm not a Muslim or an atheist or whatever. And those videos, like, I filmed them in my grandma's basement. And I woke up the next morning and they all had millions of views. And I was like, this what's happening right now? That's literally insane. And then I started to see people get saved on these live streams. And I was like, wow, this is so interesting. And thus, at that time period, through several people, the Christian TikTok niche was born, and that opened up all the doors to where I am today, where I'm traveling and I'm speaking. I'm part of Theos University, and I'm planted super deeply in a church here in Los Angeles called Cathedral, which is like my whole life. I love it so much. That's my long story short, pretty much.
Yeah, talk about why Los Angeles. How did God bring you there? Why did God bring you there? And kind of what are you feeling there? How are things unfolding there? What's your vision? What's your hope for what God might do through you there?
Yeah, I've often said that, I could never move to the Bible Belt. I grew up in Florida. People often think that Florida is the Bible Belt, which it's super not.
Right.
Just any amount of, you just read the stats and this is not the Bible Belt. You go there and you go, this is not Bible Belt culture. Northern Florida maybe is like pretty southern, but I grew up in Orlando, and I think everything Orlando and south is not Bible Belty, 100%. You could argue, Jacksonville, but that's irrelevant. So who likes Jacksonville anyway? It's the worst. It's the worst city in America. I just have to say that to bother the like 2 Jacksonville listeners potentially.
Yeah. We have a strong Jacksonville.
Yes, I've heard about the fan base in Jacksonville for P&I, as they call it there.
Yeah.
It's not Bible Belt. I didn't grow up in Bible Belt. I grew up in a deeply de-churched community. People who had left the church, families who had walked away from Christianity, just everywhere at every turn. And so kids that grew up with no context for Christianity. So I was always just like, if I ever leave here, I can't go. I just won't go to Nashville. I just won't go to Dallas. I just won't go to those places, because as much as they're amazing and I love what God is doing there, and I have friends who are doing ministry things there that I absolutely believe in, I'm just not built like that. I want to be in post-Christian places. I want to be in the worst of what America has to offer as far as like biblical worldview having people. So I was like, okay, I'm either going to end up in like New York, Seattle, maybe Phoenix, to go compete with the Mormons, or Los Angeles. And it was like, those are my or I'll stay in Florida. And I ended up with Los Angeles. I just felt like it was a place that was going head to head with a lot of darkness. And I had friends here that felt the same burden. And I was like, oh, I just want to go. I want to go to do that too. I want to face that stuff and be a part of that world. Like the Little Mermaid.
Yeah. So what your heart is for the post-Christian context, which I think, as you said, is obviously concentrated in places like LA. How have you made inroads? And like, is it still through online stuff, or are you finding you're doing things more in person? How does that work?
Yeah, totally. I don't do as much online as I feel like I should, I should be posting 10 times a day. It feels like,
It's a
maybe
lot
some,
of work.
yeah,
It's kind of
it's a
exhausting.
lot of work to do everything else. Like I'm getting married in a month and
Oh, congratulations.
yeah, thank you. I'm so excited. Today is 39 days away. We're in the
Oof.
30s now. So I just feel constant. A life just feels like the last week of senior year right now. Like it's just very like surreal.
Hmm.
So I'm like focusing on all that stuff, and I'm working on seminary, and I'm doing stuff with the church, and I'm like trying to have a social life, and I'm traveling semi regularly. So then it's like now make a bunch of really good content. It's like
Yeah.
it's like feels like the first thing to go. But yeah, as far as like reaching Los Angeles, I have lots of really really passionate friends here, and it's changed over the years. I think predominantly my goal is to reach the city through. I'm a part of a very missional church. And so, it's Los Angeles, so we're constantly having new curious people. So that's always amazing, seeing people walk through the doors of the church. But my church is a very evangelistic group of people, very, very passionate and very missional. Like our mission statement is we exist for the glory of Christ, the beauty of the bride, and the good of the city, borrowing from the book of Jeremiah. Like I'm planted in a group of people who are tangibly in many more ways than one seeking the good of Los Angeles. And that's what I'm passionate about. So yeah. And then as far as like, that's just what it looks like. It's looked many different ways over time. I had my like street evangelism phase and my party evangelism phase. Like, it's just like, I'm just gotta get everybody saved. And so, I love it. I love knowing there are so many people in this city in a city that has a reputation of like being dark and forgotten and gone, who are passionate about the same stuff.
Yeah. What would you say? Like it feels as if a lot of the models of evangelism in the church are tailored towards a very specific moment in time. You have a lot of, I would argue it's kind of a come and see model of evangelism. And we talk about this a lot in our mission, is that most of what feels like the evangelistic initiatives of churches and missions organizations is towards an audience that is largely nominal. Like it's a bit of like the Billy Graham era, big rallies, big events, or come to the church, or come during Easter, or come during Christmas. Would you, with sort of your engagement with Gen Z, with this generation in terms of evangelism, do you think that what models do you see need to go? How do you think models are evolving? What does the church need to understand? Because I'm sure you get this question all the time. What does the church need to understand, or at least from your perception of it, that we need to do to reach Gen Z? Does it got to change? What does it look like?
Yeah. Well, I think there's absolutely a place for reaching the nominal. I mean, I think that's a really important crowd of people to reach.
Yeah.
I actually I empathize with those people really deeply, and I feel pretty bad for them, because I think that's one of the worst ways to exist as a Christian, is like none of the good parts except for the title. It's just like, oh, that's such a bummer. Like, what if you knew how much better this was? So I feel great about reach. In fact, I do that a lot. I preach in youth groups and in young adult nights, and part of my focus is, hey, if you're not a Christian here, or if you are a Christian,
right,
but you don't really know Jesus, well, I'm passionate about that group of people, because I was that group of people. But the crowd that one of my best friends, his name is David, and he lives like a mile away from me now, which is a blessing from God. We can walk to and from each other's apartments. He is really passionate about the Middle East and about reaching Muslims. And I don't share that passion with him. Not my thing. I'm really passionate about reaching atheists, about reaching unchurched, agnostic people, which is making up like 20% of Gen Z's population. But there's a profound openness. And so they're more likely than others to find themselves within the four walls of a church purely out of curiosity. But there's this really big margin of people who that would never happen. There's this study that I read. There's a sociologist called Rodney Stark, and he makes the argument that the way religions grow. So, for example, he gives Mormon statistics. So in Mormonism, there's like, if they're going door to door and they're on like a house meeting, this is just how people work. So that's why obviously I don't think Mormons are Orthodox Christians or Christians at all. I'm just using the way that this works as an example.
Yeah.
when they're walking into a house and the person in the room doesn't have any serious relationship or emotional connection with a Mormon, there's less than a 1% chance that they will convert. Well, it's something, I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like, well into the 60%. If they do know and have emotional connection to and relational equity, you might say, with a Mormon. That's how human beings work. If the people that they care about are a part of a thing, they're infinitely more likely to be a part of that thing. I wish I knew the actual number. I feel like it's more impressive than that. And I just think that is the only available road to really make evangelism work, is understanding just how people operate. People want to be a part of things that the people they love are a part of. And so we have to, not in a manipulative way, but I think that with a group of people who have no Christian family members, no Christian background, none of that like cultural pressure that a nominal person might feel to figure out their faith, they're only going to ever consider, more than likely, statistically going to consider conversion and going to seriously consider the life with Jesus, unless there are people in their life who seriously care about them and that they seriously care about, who love God and are part of the church and are practicing Christians. So the sort of like that's why I started to feel like, man, it can't just be walk up to a stranger, share the gospel, walk away, because that leaves a really large group of people who, with those odds, would never convert, would never actually consider the words that you're saying, just because of how people work.
Right. Yeah. We talk about you need to recognize the scene that God has called you to. And in our mission, art and music has played a large role. And so we use that kind of vernacular, but essentially, right, a scene is just a group of people gathering around a particular interest. And so where has God placed you where you can establish those relationships and those emotional connections? And then not as a means to an end, because like you said, it needs to be authentic. It's not manipulation, but in the context of whatever it is, if it's, going to the gym, or you're part of like some pickup soccer thing, or you're whatever it is that you happen to be gathering around, in that context, authentically living your life and then using opportunities when inspired by the Holy Spirit to share your faith. Like you said, I think that's going to be when we see effective fruit, right?
Yeah.
But how do you feel like how do we get people to recognize that? Or what are the barriers for that happening for people? Do you know what I'm saying? Because it feels almost obvious to say it, and yet it's not obvious and it's not easy. Are we isolated? Are we not intentional? What gaps do we need to bridge in order for that type of evangelism to become more ubiquitous in the church?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I can't speak for the church, right. I suppose I can speak for the Christians that I've seen. I think the main thing that I would see as becoming a possible inhibitor to this is that we tend to we like to be in our groups, our like-minded groups of people who think like us and act like us, which is normal and is to be expected and is generally okay. But that can come at the cost of effective discipleship and missions if your only interest is spending all of your time with Christians. Like I just think that Christians need to actively make time to spend time with people who are not followers of Jesus, and to be, I think that's what it is. Like, I just think it's easier to be like, my whole friend group, the only people I'm ever going to spend time with, and it's just these Christian people. And that's cool. And I'm really glad you're doing that. I think community is so essential, but like to have a missional mindset means that recognizing it isn't just like, I'm going to share the gospel with this cashier. It's, I'm going to lay aside time in my personal life to pour into and be there for and provide and be a friend to someone who doesn't look like me and who isn't living the same lifestyle as me, and hope that it develops a relationship where I can be a light to them and I can show them what I've experienced. Yeah, but that's a very intentional decision. That doesn't happen on accident. You can't just expect every convert to walk through your door begging for the gospel. Like, we won't all be Jonathan Edwards with people like knocking on our door at 2 a.m, like, please tell us about sinners in the hands of an angry God. It's just like, that's not what's going to happen for the vast majority of us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's convicting, because I would say that even like preceding that desire to create those connections and then ultimately have those conversations, there has to be a care. Like you
Right.
actually have to care. And how do we get that? Right? I just feel like it's so easy to get so wrapped up in your own stuff. And like you even mentioned all these amazing things that are happening in your life, and you get so swept up in your own stuff that, and then you mentioned another keyword, time, right? It's not enough to just go to the cashier and just share. And God uses that. I know,
Absolutely.
imagine you agree. He uses that. But by and large, it's got to be a brokenhearted thing. Like we've got to actually allow God to break our hearts to compel us to create the space and the time. How do we, would you say that that's kind of the first thing that has to fall as opposed to just intellectually understanding this?
Yeah. I think I'm very much of the opinion that the heart follows the hand. So what you do will change how you feel.
Sure. Yep.
I think that the only way to get a broken heart for non-believers is to spend some time sitting across non-believers and to understand why you ought to be brokenhearted. I think that's the only pathway. I've prayed many times, God, give me a heart for the lost. And I love that. But I think the most effective way to gain a heart for the lost is to just start pursuing and seeking the lost. That's the only thing that's actually done that for me. The passion for evangelism for me has grown out of just doing evangelism because I knew I needed to do it. And so I think we all want to feel like spiritually, emotionally compelled to do these things. And I just think that's foolish. I think that's childish. I think actually you should just know what is right and you should do it. And you should watch as your heart follows your actions. I think what we feel is more often controlled by the things that we do than the opposite way around. It's people often ask like, man, how do you become humble? And I think you just start doing things that only humble people can do, right? Like a humble, prideful person cannot do this thing. So I'm going to do that thing because it's going to make me humble in the process. And I'll become humble by doing it. I'll feel more humble by doing it. I think that's just how that works. If you want to be a good evangelist, then just decide, man, I get to choose when I schedule my life out. I get to choose what I give my time to. And I'm going to put it in the freaking calendar. I'm going to spend one day a week with someone who doesn't, one evening a week at dinner with somebody I know, a coworker or a friend who doesn't know Jesus. And that's undeniable. That is going to happen I'm going to do that and build a discipline out of that because I think that's how things become important to us is by just choosing that they're going to be important, that they're going to be a priority.
Yeah, no, that's so good. And I've heard the expression see, feel, do. It's often, you're not going to, if you're waiting for, like you said, for this moment, like God, just zap my heart with a transformative compassion for the lost. I mean, again, he can do whatever he wants, but
absolutely
every important thing in my life is a decision. And the emotions are like the cart dragged behind the horse, like somewhat even reluctantly at times.
Yes.
You're, as you mentioned, you're about to get married. I've been married for 15 years. It's a decision 99 out of 100 moments. It's not some fluttery feeling. It's I'm in. Till I breathe my last breath, I am here. I am in. And it's the same for every important thing we do in life. And, funny, you mentioned humble, like, how do we get humility? It's like, there's a reason why it's humble yourself. It's not like feel more humble. It's like, put yourself in the low position. Even if your flesh goes writhing and kicking and screaming, it's like the whole evangelism thing, I am not, I would say by nature, a very extroverted person, certainly not in a salesman-y kind of one-on-one context. Now, to be fair, maybe 1 out of 1,000 people truly are that real, prototypical salesman personality. But I know that I have to do things to put myself in those positions of risk where the Holy Spirit will show up. And then I, like you said, all of the other things about that come to life when I make the decision to do it.
Yeah.
And so even for me, like I hear all what you're saying about the street evangelism stuff having its place, but maybe needing to fall in balance with more relational sides. But man, I sometimes have to push myself to get back out on the streets at times for precisely the things that it produces in me, the humility, the dependency on God. Like I'll go out and do street interview stuff, like I know you've done, or talking to people on the streets, and I hate it, man. Like I literally tell our videographer, it's like I take my flesh on a skillet, and I'm like, all right, God, I know I'm not going to like this, but I'm just doing this, and it's like my self, my concern of my own reputation and the guarding of my time. You're absolutely right. We have to just it's so much of this Christian life is that commitment and the decisions that follow that commitment.
Absolutely.
Oh man. So I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and I love this stuff, and it's obvious you do as well. And sometimes I feel, we talked about nominal Christians earlier on and your heart for them. And I totally agree with you. And sometimes I feel like some of these kinds of conversations just don't even make sense yet to an unsurrendered heart. And we're always surrendering our hearts. I get that. But as someone who works with youth, with young adults, who speaks in churches, like, do you feel like there's just a baseline need to truly surrender to Jesus, for even conversations about how do I evangelize, and do you know what I'm saying? Because sometimes I'm with other Christians and I'm like, I don't think they're even thinking about this stuff. And I don't mean that to be arrogant, but it's kind of just a moralism. It's kind of just I want to be a good person, and I go to church, and do you feel like the average Christian is even concerned about these things, let alone wrestling with the methodology or the decision that needs to be made?
Yeah. Okay. Well, two things. I think there's only two things that can really prompt someone to at least cognitively understand the need for evangelism. And that's number one, is they're going to go, oh, I desperately need Jesus. And I'm so cooked without him. And I hate life without him. And I would never want to go back to life without him. Now that I have him, holy smokes, there's nothing you could give me to convince me to go back to that kind of life.
Right.
Well, now you have the compassion that you need to look and go, that's what everybody else is still living in. And they don't know what this life with God is like. Man,
right.
I'm everybody needs to know this. I'm so selfish. I need people to experience what I've experienced. That's number one. Number two, my this past Sunday, my pastor shared something where he was saying how there's three major conversations that God has with Moses, where Moses is interceding on behalf of Israel. And God's like, I'm going to destroy Israel. I'm going to wipe them out. I'm going to start over with you. And Moses is like, yo, hold up. And he says, God, but what about your own glory? What about your glory? And it feels like, Moses is playing a trick on God and manipulating him. But no, Moses just genuinely has a primary concern for the glory of God. Moses is like, no, God, I want you to be glorified. That's what he's worried about. And until someone has experienced Jesus, they're never going to gain that mindset. They're never going to gain I should be missional. I should care about people because I want this Jesus that I love to be glorified. There's this famous story from it's possibly a myth, but I hope that it's true, from the early Moravians, which are these proto-reformers. Mm-hmm. And the story goes that there were these two men who heard about this group on a Caribbean island. I can't remember which one, and slaves there who had never heard the gospel. And in a burden to get there and to preach the gospel to the people there was no other way for them to get there except for them to sell themselves into slavery. And so that's what they did. They sold themselves into slavery. And the legend goes that as they're sailing away, that they're standing at the back of the boat, waving to their friends and family, saying, let the lamb who was slain receive the reward of his suffering. And I'm like, holy smokes, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. Then it goes that they got there and the people were like, no, you can't sell yourself into slavery. So they just evangelized. But the heart was there. And I love that story so much. And I just think until someone has had their life gripped by the gospel, well, they're not going to care about Jesus receiving the reward that he deserves for that gospel. Revelation, they praise him in Revelation 5. Why? Because you purchased a people for yourself. You purchased a people for God by your blood. That's a huge deal. When I know that now, I feel like, oh, Jesus is worthy of every single person. He's worthy of receiving the love and the repentance and the submission and the surrender of every single person that I see. Until you've experienced that, you're not going to understand why you would ever evangelize, because it's they don't really need this. And also, I don't really care if Jesus gets this. Those two motivations are pretty important.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know where I heard this, but it's the least sexy version of Christianity is one that just makes you a cleaner person. And I think for a lot of people, their faith is a worldview, or it's an intellectual system, or it's a cultural club. And again, I'm not trying to be judgmental. I feel an intense gratitude for what I understand and know, and the role the Holy Spirit plays in even illuminating that to me. But it's until you recognize it for the beautiful thing that it is, not because of necessarily even anything it produces, but the rich beauty of just knowing your dad and having that relationship and the joy and the satisfaction and the way it opens your eyes to the reality of the world and the hope and purpose that you now have in him. And until I think you feel the infectious goodness of that reality in your own life, as you said, all you're really selling to people is a competing moral system that comes with and especially for young people, that comes with a lot of like reputational consequences. It's like,
and 90% of what people are thinking about is just like the sexual ethic.
Right.
So all it comes down to is like, hey, come view sexuality and gender the way that I do.
Right.
In other words, hey, come be a conservative. And you're like, wait, stop. There's so much just got shed from what this is actually about. I'm a conservative and I very happily hold to a Christian sexual ethic. But if that's like the bare bones of what makes you different in your worldview from somebody else, that's all. You are not going to be able to give an invitation that helps anybody at all. Like people are just not going to, come view sexuality my way because mine's from God. You're like,
right.
Okay, well, like, is there any other good reason to be a part of this? That's what's coming to people's minds. There has to be a better, you got to understand the gospel better than that to give a better explanation of why someone should really follow Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like you understand a father-son relationship in a human sense through the lens of like, what foods you want them to eat or not eat, like as if that describes the beauty and intimacy of a father-son. Exactly. It's like, come on, like, yeah, this stuff matters. And he has a great design for you that's for your thriving. But if you reduce the father-son relationship to the parameters of how they're supposed to live, as opposed to the beauty of the relationship, it's like, it's just not a good sell. And it's funny you say that about the sexual ethic thing, because it reminds me in a weird reverse way of the Aldous Huxley quote, where he talks about how he didn't want God to exist precisely for the ability to have freedom sexually, right? Because if that's all they view it as, and he's that very honest atheist in admitting that that's pretty much why he didn't want God to exist, because in his mind, all God was just a prohibitive moral system.
And a lot of Christians feel exactly like that, by the way. A lot of Christians feel that way about the Christian moral system that we have, is it would be very convenient actually for this God that I grew up believing in to not exist so that I could go on in my life doing these things without feeling the guilt of it. And I think that sucks. And I think that is going to make you a really bad evangelist. I thought that way. And there's a reason I saw no converts, is because, so just for example, I have a sermon clip that I posted a couple months ago in which I describe, the relationship that Christ has offered us through the gospel, that Jesus gave up everything so that he could have us as his children and as his friends, which I think is biblical language. He says, if you keep my commandments, you're my friends, John 15:14. And it's all over the Bible. And so I love that language. I think it's really important. And this guy, the younger guy, comments and says, Christ isn't your friend, buddy. He's your Lord. And I'm like, okay. So I comment and I'm like, hey, dude, like, I get what you're going for. I'm being biblical. Like, I know this is right. There's nothing wrong with what I'm saying. Yeah, well, submission isn't an option. And God doesn't need you. I'm like, what about friendship with God means any of those? I'm confused. Well, so long as Christians have like really just shredded, terrible, bad views of the gospel, they're not going to be good representatives of the gospel. And I can tell you what, not only was I a bad evangelist, I was an infrequent evangelist so long as I didn't understand the extent of the good news and the love of God. So long as I had that belief that like, man, I would wish that this wasn't true, If eternity didn't exist, that would actually be convenient for me, because I'm really just worried about hell. And if that wasn't on the table, I would like that because I could do whatever I wanted. Well, that's someone who doesn't understand the heart of God, who doesn't understand Christianity very well. And so you're never going to be able to pitch to someone, hey, this is a life that you should live, because most people are human beings and they just can't find themselves caring about hell for more than an afternoon. It just won't. Human beings don't think about death as much as we would like them to. They don't think about what's going to. So if your motivation for you should come and be a part of my religion, because if you don't, you'll go to hell when you die. That's just, you have a better understanding of human psychology. Like, unless that's been put in your brain from the time you were 4 years old and onward. And I believe in hell. Okay, I'm a historic Orthodox Christian believer. I believe in eternal conscious torment like that. I'm with the historic teachings of the church. I just understand human beings, and it will never be a good enough motivation. And by the way, it was never the evangelism strategy of anybody in the Bible.
No.
Ever. It just wasn't. So I think you got to really get the gospel in order to give the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you get this brand of Christianity where you have a bunch of people who are just trying to figure out where the line is, right? It's like, where is too far? How far is too far? How close can I get to sinning and still be cool, still retain my hell insurance? There's no wonder that is such an unappealing vision when, like you said, even those people are just living this kind of repressed life where, like you said, if they could just be honest, they would admit, yeah, actually, if I didn't believe in this whole eternal consequence thing, then I kind of just would like to live this unbridled secular life.
You hate your life, Christian, who's evangelizing to me, and you wish that you were living mine, but you want me to come live yours. I'm sorry. I'm not saying yes to that pitch because I can see through you. I can see that you hate the way that you live. That's why I think I've come to believe that the best angle for Christian evangelism is to be the most radically satisfied, insanely happy person that anybody knows. I just think I just enjoy my life. I enjoy God, and my life is full of pleasure and satisfaction. I think that is appealing to a world that feels meaningless and feels depressed and feels lost. I'm not talking about forcing anything, and I'm not preaching the prosperity gospel. I just like God, and I like living my life with God. David says in Psalm chapter 16, verse 11, he says, in your presence, I have joy and I have everlasting pleasure. That's the Elijah Lamb version. Those two things I got right. Everlasting pleasure and joy. That's what he says. When I'm with you, when I'm at your right hand, I have those things. Yeah. And he says, your love is better than life. I'm like, Christians got to start enjoying God and enjoying being Christian because it's the best way to live. I often say, if Christians can't be happy, then who can? Who can? Who in the world can be happy if the people who have the thing that they were made to have, God, can't be happy? I mean, that's problematic for me. If you're like, yeah, the Christian life is super sad and hard all the time and terrible, and the life outside of God's like super happy and full of pleasure and amazing, and I'm jealous of it. But you should be a Christian because I want you to go to heaven when you die. It's like, man, what if you actually liked God? Which I think you should. What if you believed that all these commands that you hate that you've been given are just God is super wise and good and has given them because he knows what's best for us and wants us to live good lives with him, Yeah. Maybe it'd be a more effective evangelism if you liked being a Christian.
Or life, or didn't just have a life that basically emulated the people that you're trying to reach, but minus the whole, worldview that makes you an alien and an outsider to culture. Yeah. No, dude, the joy thing is so fascinating to me. We have a part of our mission is we have like an evangelistic art music group that goes all over the world and presents the gospel. And one of the things I often say to our guys, and it's a fun, creative, expressive show, and it's humorous, it's fun, it's everything. But I will often say, I really honestly believe that the more joy we exhibit, the more effective this tends to be. Like when people look at us, like I'll have people come up to me after our performance and just say, man, I didn't think Christians could act that way or look like that or be that. Like you guys are like, you just seem fun and you love each other and it's not so stuffy. It doesn't take itself so seriously, but it's also expressive and passionate and creative. There is a profound power in joy that then is embodied in a person that when the moment's right in a non just sort of Bible bashing way is also willing to share, is also willing to say, hey, by the way, this is what I believe. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm not going to hit you with it every 2 seconds, but it is part of who I am. Yeah. And I think the authority that gives your words when you can actually back that up with the life that seems to reflect the creator God inside of you. Oh man, again, people have to make their own choices, but you're dead right. That is incredibly powerful. Totally. And I would say another side of that, and this is much more of a sober, hard side of this, and I'll be the first to admit I've not had to live much of this, but I think how we endure hardship, right? Life is hard. Yeah. And I think it's not only our joy in good times, but it's our resilience. Wouldn't you say it's also our resilience in suffering that speaks volumes to a world that ultimately pretends it lives with a worldview that says we're all just molecules in motion with no ultimate purpose or end. And yet in the face of suffering, that is a pretty bleak way to live, wouldn't you say? Yeah. I might say what Paul says, right? Like this faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. I mean, by exhibiting those things, when I endure suffering, I have hope. I have hope. And that when bad things aren't happening, a person who has an atheistic worldview feels like that's something worth making fun of.
And then bad things happen. And then they wish they had hope because they're human beings who want it. You know what I mean? Yeah. So when I have it, when I hold on to it, when I really believe in it, when I hold faith, hope, and love for God, well, man, that's really, really, really compelling. I think that's important 100%. I have something that gives context to my suffering and provides meaning to the parts of life that are difficult. Everybody is longing for that. Everybody. But if I treat my sufferings and my difficulties the same way as everybody else does, well, I'm communicating that my sufferings feel just as meaningless as yours. And I think Christians need to wrestle through that and figure out why we feel that way.
Yeah. So what are you dreaming about? What are you excited for? What's next? I know you already mentioned a lot of things that are happening in your life. You're a really busy guy in a busy season, but man, if you could see anything happening through you, what are you dreaming about? What are you excited about for the future?
It's a really great question.
And maybe coupled with that, starting with what freaks you out? What do you think is a huge threat that we have to be aware of? And then maybe what are you also excited about, just to hit both sides of that coin?
A huge threat. I don't know. Maybe I'm not pessimistic enough to have I don't have a wartime anxiety. Well, something overseas coming our way. No, I don't know. That's a really great question. I think that as far as Gen Z, we're in a really interesting cultural moment, and we're seeing some intense worldview clashing. And I am both hopeful and worried about the outworkings of nihilism. I think that's what so many young people have adopted. They've adopted a view of the world wherein everything is meaningless. And I think that opens a really wide door to Christianity. And I'm excited and hopeful to see Christians take advantage of that opportunity. I'm worried about where it leads us morally until it's interrupted. That's what I would say. So I see it as a wide open window for the gospel, where people are not just de-churched, but unchurched. They reject nominalism as a whole. They're unaffiliated. They call us the nuns, right? Like, we have no religious affiliation, many atheistic, many agnostic, with a profound openness, which I think is really significant. But the general approach to life is that nothing really matters. I just preached on this Sunday, so it's all I'm thinking about right now. But we're all Marxists and nihilists and Freudians, whether we know it or not. It's just gotten into us. So whether you've read their work or not, it's reflected in everything that we do. And so people feel that way. They feel that morality doesn't exist, and that everything powerful is oriented against them, and that a sexual ethic is suppressive. And so it's just nothing matters, And I think as that continues to be developed, for example, Sigmund Freud had this idea that sexual suppression was actually a good thing. That when religion told us that we shouldn't behave a certain way, that was a good thing. He said it was another way. It was meaningless. It wasn't a reflection of any true morality, but it helped. It was an agreement that we all made so that society could advance. So there wouldn't be, a small group of men who dominated the whole society. And so he believed that sexual suppression was helpful, but he believed that if people wanted to be happy, that had to come away, that had to leave. That he says that, this is almost an exact quote, I'm getting it slightly wrong, that man needs to make eroticism the central part of his life in order to be satisfied, in order to be happy. Well, we've only grown in hedonism since then. We've only grown in self-centeredness since then, where everything dies on the altar of their happiness. And so we see that those limitations in our culture on sexuality are disappearing. And I think that's super dangerous. I worry about where that takes us culturally and societally, and the way that will affect people. I worry about the damage that will do to people's souls 100%. But I also think, again, it's an open window where, we're not evangelizing to the cultural landscape has shifted. So if I was using the language of Acts, for the past 100 years, we've been evangelizing in America to Jews. And as of 2020, we are now evangelizing to pagans and Gentiles. And so the approach is different. I think that you might consider the way that Paul speaks to Jews and Gentiles is super different. You can read his approach and evangelism on the Areopagus. It doesn't even sound like Paul. It sounds like somebody else completely, because it's like he's taken his Jewish worldview completely off so that he can appeal to these pagans. And I think that's what it's going to take. But it's a massive open window, massive. And I think there's a potential for us to see unprecedented numbers of conversion, the way that the early Christians saw it happen in ancient Rome. I think that could happen. But I think that we have to keep becoming Rome for that window of opportunity to continue to widen. And I'm not a fan of Rome. And so I think I worry about that while simultaneously being really hopeful that history is, our future is not determined and no two societies are exactly the same. I just think that we'll be pulled in two opposite directions really tightly all at once. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Yeah. Why would you say it's a unique opportunity? I mean, I love the example. So the Acts 17 example of Paul quoting the Athenian philosophers and poets and using their language. And I think you're exactly right. What is it about this cultural moment that you think is both challenging and worrisome on some level, but also a unique opportunity? What is it?
I think there's every generation has its sort of commonplace roadblocks to evangelism and to conversion. And I think ours look the most intimidating, but are actually the most easily toppled. So whereas, earlier generations have built brick walls, we've put up little orange barrier fences that can just be like, but they're bright and they're aggressive and they say, caution, do not enter. And they're very aggressive and in your face, but they don't have the sturdiness or the strength that they used to. That's basically my off the dome analogy of what I think is happening. The resistance that young people have towards the gospel is just is weak, and it's not very well rooted. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity where, you will have to confront those things, but when confronted, they're easily toppled. So I think especially like with nihilism, nothing really matters. Well, that's not true. Things do matter. I was talking to my pastor about this movie. Man, I can't remember it now, but it's Ashton Kutcher and BJ Novak. And there is basically Ashton Kutcher is like this celebrity dude, and he's done something horrible. And he confesses to it on recording, and he doesn't care. He's like stone cold. And he's like, in a world where everything means everything, nothing means anything. And that just is like, oh, wow, that's depressing. And then BJ Novak's character responds and says, some things mean something. And I like, as we were talking about, I was like, that's so cool. That is such a cool response and a way of handling that. And I think that most people are landing in the everything means everything, so nothing means anything world. And that's not a good way to live. And I think the Christian angle of no, actually, everything means so much. People are more interested in that. I think it goes back to the whole, be joyful and enjoy being a Christian, because when people are looking at converting, they're asking themselves some really simple questions like, their value system, will it be better for me? And do I want to imitate the kind of life that they have? Would I prefer if my life was less like my life and more like theirs? And I think as Christians live lives that are just utterly full of meaning, people will be drawn to that, and they won't be able to help it, because as much as they might feel like, no, Christianity's old and forgotten and washed up, they'll look and they'll go, but they're so good at being alive. Yeah, I really wish that my life looked like theirs. The feeling of, I can achieve what Christians have achieved without Christianity is dying. And I think that's important. Yeah.
Well, and I also think it's helping, while of course recognizing, and with the caveat that all of this ultimately is the work of the Holy Spirit, I think it's also helping people recognize that some of their deepest intuitions and instincts make sense in a Christian worldview in a way that their secularism cannot afford it. So their idea that the individual matters, that the oppressed matters, that the rights of the marginalized matters, that's fundamentally a Judeo-Christian perspective. The idea that, we should fight for justice in the absence of a moral framework that makes absolutely no sense. Also our just innate sense that our life should matter, that there's purpose. And even this deep, unshakable feeling that we are immortal in a sense, that life should go on beyond death. These are all, of course, deeply rooted in as part of our divine inheritance as image bearers of God. And so just gently being, I think, the key word, helping people to recognize that, hey, this Christian thing, beyond being joy giving and life producing, also helps you live a more congruent, coherent life without so much dissonance, where you've got to affirm moral relativism while being morally outraged all the time, which of course makes no sense. And
Right.
and deep down, people can sense that internal dissonance. And so when you can identify those moral or those spiritual longings, rather, that people have, and help people recognize how they're affirmed in Jesus, I think that also goes a long way in terms of removing some of the barriers you mentioned and helping people open their hearts to the reality of God.
Yeah. John Henry Newman said that the consciousness is the primordial vicar of Christ in the soul, which is super nerdy, but I think that's important because consciousness hasn't gone away. You know, that's still in every single person. So absolutely no one can escape that dissonance. No one can escape that. Actually, the way I feel and the things that I say and the way that I live, they don't match very well. And that's irking me and that's bothering me. And that's kind of tearing me up inside. That doesn't go away. That hasn't gone away. And God will continue to use that tool in people. Because he's written the law in our hearts. You know, that's basic biblical premise. Every single person actually has a longing for God's law put in them by God, and can only outrun it for so long. You know, when you're not trying to supplement it, right? So the experiment, like the postmodern experiment, or rather the modern experiment, is we can do objective morality without God. You know, he can sort of be like a background figure that we have who justifies the system, but we don't really need to be connected to him or submitted to him in order to have objective morality. He can just be like a philosophical object that we use to source it from. Well, the postmodernists go like, no, and that's the climate that we're in now. There is none of that. Like the whole like moral life thing is out the door because that objective moral system that we all want just is gone. And so the simple, basic biblical idea that the law has been written on our hearts has disappeared, and the experiment has failed a lot of people. And it'll send them back to pre-modernism, which is just a Christianity, is where it'll send them. I think that's where postmodernism lands, and that's the only place that it can go, where people still remain sane in the end. Yeah.
Maybe as sort of a last question, I think something you said there at the end is that the consequences of this worldview that leads them into actions and behaviors that ultimately wreak havoc in their lives, I think are driving a lot of people to a form of spirituality. But at least in my experience, that sort of that submission, that surrender to the actual personal creator God, that remains a big hurdle, at least in my experience. It'd rather be this ambiguous spiritual force that kind of fills or connects some of those internal feelings and angst that I have, but not something that I have to define and in so doing submit to. Yeah. How do you speak into that? How do you speak into that? I want my spirituality, but it can be anything, and just don't put a name on it so I don't have to surrender to it.
Yeah, there's a couple things. I think number one, human beings are really bad at making gods, and we make really ugly gods because they look like us. Mm-hmm. I think the Romans and the Greeks were bad at making gods because the Romans and Greeks were bad, right? So they made really ugly gods that looked like them and were probably worse than them, right? And then because of that trickles down for generations. They all keep living that way because their gods act that way,
right?
And so I think that dissonance doesn't go away. The feeling of like this God, this ambiguous God that I've created, doesn't check the boxes I actually want it to check. We'll realize that these things are sort of mutually exclusive. Like if you want a God that brings meaning to your world, that God also has to be morally opinionated. he has to care about everything. If that God only cares about the things that you care about, well, that's not a God. That's just you, right? That's all that is you. And we all know that if there's going to be a God, he's going to care about more than just the stuff that's important to me, and more than the stuff that's just convenient to me. C.S. Lewis says something in one of his essays. He said that the Christian and the materialist have very different beliefs about the world, and they cannot both be right. He says that if the Christian does happen to be right, then there's just no way that the moralist or the materialist can be equally empowered to live a good life as the Christian. There's just no way. They won't orient their lives correctly because they don't know how the world works. And I think people need to see that it's the Christian vision as a whole that makes a good life possible. Not just belief in a God, but belief in this God, belief in the biblical Trinity, belief in the God who has given law and has made everything and has answered to evil and to suffering. An ambiguous sort of spiritual deistic God that kind of exists has not given us a final eschatological response to suffering and to evil and to sin and to death. He hasn't. That God has not. That God that doesn't exist has done nothing about the problems humanity is actually facing. And so creating this God as a sort of place filler to make us feel better. Well, what does he make you feel better about? Well, you feel slightly less alone, but then you're confronted by evil and wickedness and injustice and pain and suffering and death. And then it's like, well, the God that I've invented doesn't have an answer to these things. Well, the God of the Bible does.
Yeah.
The God of the Bible is the one that we can look at and go, oh, trample death, where is your sting? Right? We can feel that way. Oh, serpent, your head's been squashed. Good luck for you. It's not going well for you. The God of the gospel is the only God worth believing in. And if he happens to be true and real, then we will just be equipped to live in the world better than people who don't believe in him. And so the goal for me is to live lives that vindicate our message. So I'm living in the moral system provided to me by the God of the Bible. And that moral system leads to flourishing. And that's a vindication of the fact that this God is real and that the moral system he's given us is really necessary and really helpful. I don't know if that answers the question. I kind of jumped around a bajillion places.
No, it totally answers the question. And I think, again, this is where in the context of relationship and discipleship, because I believe discipleship happens not just when someone comes to Jesus, but when they first meet a authentic follower of Jesus, you're already on that road of discipleship. And I think helping people to recognize that, again, the profound longings they have for being validated as an individual of worth is found in a personal God placing his image into a person. Like, that is not a vague process. That is a very specific transaction taking place between a personal God. Likewise, the God, sort of a vague God that does not come in the form of Jesus as a suffering servant into this earth to deal with sin and death, again, is someone that doesn't ultimately satisfy our desire for justice, because justice isn't done by some ambiguous God with no sort of clearly recognized prescripts. So it's kind of like you bought the medicine, but you didn't take it. So it doesn't quite work. Like, you've got to not only recognize this as true, but then also accept that you need this personally. And in the absence of that, it just remains an intellectual idea that will not lead to the kind of internal consistency and flourishing, albeit still within a harsh world. It's gonna make things not perfect. So anyway, dude, I feel like I go on and on. I want to respect your time. I'm just grateful your door closed, truly. That was a sign.
Thanks
that we should,
God.
That we should both celebrate. But man, I'm stoked with what you're doing. I'm excited to follow it from afar. Keep doing what you're doing, man. Thanks for taking the time on this podcast. And I love these kinds of conversations, so I hope I can have you back sometime.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, dude. All right, that's it. Peace.